I would say to Democrats and Republicans, we have to put country before party very clearly in the public view. And this is about the Constitution of the United States. The clarity of the president's actions is compelling and gave us no choice but to move forward.
Welcome back to Harvard. That was, of course, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi early today, making her appeal to lawmakers as she leads the impeachment proceeding into President Trump's conduct. It was just 3 days ago that Pelosi announced the formal inquiry. And now members of Congress say they could potentially draft articles of impeachment in a matter of weeks. This will only be, by the way, the fourth time in our country's history that a president has faced the imminent threat of impeachment. President Trump would be following in the footsteps of Andrew Johnson, Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, of course. I'm joined by Lawrence Tribe, Harvard Law professor and author of To End a Presidency, The Power of Impeachment. Professor, tell us what's different now about the charge that now lies against the president compared to all that we've discussed for the last 2 to 3 years?
Well, actually, what's different, not only compared to the last 2 or 3 years, but compared to the rest of our history, including all of the prior impeachments, is that this is the first time a president will have been impeached for violating his oath in a way that threatens national security in the sphere of foreign policy and military policy. We are now talking about not just what happened in the past in 2016. We're talking about what's going to happen to the 2020 election. And we have a case where the President of the United States deliberately withheld $400 million worth of desperately needed military aid that had been voted in a bipartisan way by Congress from a vulnerable little ally of ours in Europe under attack, military attack, by an adversary, Russia, that had helped this president win election and that now he is beholden to. This is the paradigm case. This is the case the framers had in mind. We've never had it before. A case in which a president demonstrably, and even by his own confession, uses the power of his office, the majesty of his office, not to serve the national security interests of America, but to serve the personal interests for re-election and perhaps eventual wealth and fame and power by the president. This is it. This is the case they were waiting for.
Well, let's talk about that in the language of the Constitution, sir. High crime. Is this a high crime we're talking about?
This is the example of a high crime. It's a crime against the nation and an abuse of the president's oath. That's what they meant. They didn't necessarily mean jaywalking or tax violation or shooting someone on Fifth Avenue. Those are crimes, but a high crime is a betrayal of the United States.
Let me ask you about the evidence that's now before us. It's unique to begin a discussion when you have the evidence before you like this in such clear terms. The language of the president's conversation with the president of Ukraine, the language at least kept, commemorated by the notes kept by the White House and the national security staff. It does have that combination of sentences. The president of Ukraine is asking for missiles to stop Russian tanks, Javelin missiles, a particular set of weapons he needs to stop the tanks from further coming into his country. The president is saying, I'd like a favor from you, though, stopping him in his tracks and saying, this is what I want.
It couldn't be clearer. I mean,
what do we need more here? What more evidence or hearings or subpoenas or citations for contempt? Or what more busy work does Congress have to proceed to?
Well, citations for contempt aren't needed. And essentially, we already have the core of what we need. But the nation is going to demand, and the Congress is going to provide, a flood of subpoenas to make sure that guys like Pompeo and Giuliani and Barr and maybe Pence are at least given an opportunity to come and tell their side of the story. But those subpoenas, including the one that was issued today, wisely, to Pompeo, all have to have a terminal date. They can't be an excuse for dragging things out indefinitely. And what the House Intelligence Committee needs to tell these people is, if you invoke some phony version of a non-existent absolute immunity or executive privilege, we will infer against the president everything that we need to infer. We're not going to allow you simply to stonewall. We're going to treat your stonewalling as evidence not only of consciousness of guilt, but of actual guilt. That's what has to happen. And we don't need more evidence, but we need to look for it and draw the right inferences from people's refusal to provide it.
I understand that you appreciated what I said last night about 1940 and what would have happened had Churchill offered or asked for destroyers, about 50 old destroyers, Mr. President. And our president said, yeah, but I won't give them to you unless you give me some dirt on Wendell Willkie. It's unimaginable.
Right, and I like what you said. He wouldn't have to put it quite that way. He wouldn't have to say, I won't give them to you unless. That's a little bit crude. But if he had said, I know you need defense against the Luftwaffe, and by the way, I need some help against Wendell Willkie. You know, it doesn't take a stable genius to connect those dots. It seems to me that's what we've got here. It's really out in the open. And right now, although there are risks to impeachment, I agree that the 20 Republicans might see the light. But there are bigger risks to non-impeachment. Whatever happens in the Senate, the House now has to do its constitutional duty if it cares as much as I hope it does about our republic and about saving our Constitution.
It's an honor to have you on, sir. An even greater honor to know you're watching when you're not on. Thank you so much, Laurence Tribe, professor of law at Harvard.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.